Hi everyone, it's Gigabeef here. Today we have a question for you. Are you part of the AK gang or the M4 squad? This is always a question in any modern shooter, and in Tarkov it is no different. Today we're going to compare them and decide which you should run at various stages of your Tarkov career. So stick around and let's get going. Okay, so there are three broad categories of player that we're going to delve into today, as your choice between the weapons really depends on your progression so far through the game. Firstly, we'll look at newer players, likely up to level 15 or 20. At this stage you'll not have the flea market for a bit, and then you'll start using it a bit more as you work your way up to intermediate. Intermediate players I would consider from about level 20, with a few trader levels and a frequent user of the flea market at this stage. Late game players should then have maxed or close to max traders, have a good portion of their hideout upgraded, by at least Bitcoin level 1, which requires level 3 mechanic, so it's not really possible until at least level 30. This video is obviously not for late game players, but I think it's useful to see where the path leads for those starting the Tarkov journey. Firstly, let's talk about the base gun costs, which are going to be of most interest to our newer player. At this point you're likely to be modding as little as possible, if any at all, and just trying to get something that you can kill dudes with as cheaply as possible. There's a couple of limited things that you can do at super low level, which I've actually gone through in another video about budget AK modding, which I'll link to above. You can't even buy an M4 from the traders until you get either mechanic or peacekeeper to level 2, and with Tarkov's Russian setting, AKs are just much more prevalent than anything else. Western guns are all imported and so rarer and used primarily by external forces like the UN peacekeepers in the lore. Practically speaking, AKs are plentiful due to the availability on scavs, which is why newer players should focus primarily on the AK platform. You shouldn't actually need to buy that many of them after a few successful scav or pistol PMC raids, given that there are so many base AK-74 and AKMS gun styles around. These weapons almost always go for less than the trader values on the flea, as there is a ready and free supply into the game economy. M4s are only really found rarely in weapons crates and on raiders, outside of purchases with the traders themselves. This means you'll have to go to the flea market for them once you hit level 10, and they're around 60k there as base, which is expensive for newcomers and come with few advantages at stock. Once you're level 2 with mechanic, there is a trick you can use to buy an M4 from scratch for 30k, which again I'll link to above, which can start to make it a bit more interesting. But obviously when you first start, you really should just use any gun that you can get your hands on. But I would try to use the 7.62 varieties as much as possible, like the AKMS, as 7.62 PS rounds are actually relatively decent to most other starter bullets. As we move into the intermediate category, the most important factor for players is around overall cost, including attachments and modding. As discussed already, AKs are just so much easier to get hold of, and although there are ways to cheap into an M4 as mentioned, as soon as you get into modding, AKs really start to show their advantages around budget performance. It's actually quite hard to mod an M4 well with traders lower than level 3, because Peacekeeper and Mechanic hold so many of the good parts, and the flea is now so expensive these days with finding raid. This really blocks players from using the M4 until much later on in their progression. AKs also let you step up your modding in much smaller increments, with things like cheap compensators, butt pads, and super value handguards like the AK100 to justify mounting cheap grips as well. As an intermediate player, we're typically not looking for a meta weapon, but something that performs decently, and buying either near top or top tier rounds like 545 BP or BT, which are in the 250 to 400 rubles range roughly, if not BS or Ingolnik for special uses or PvP directly. Usually in the intermediate category, players switch over to the 545 AKs for the decreased recoil on modding and the larger range of ammo. PS 7.62 is not quite good enough to become a staple of the mid-game, and BP is quite expensive for its performance at 745 rubles, and is locked behind Prapor's Punisher Part 5 questline, which is really quite far along, although you can potentially make it in the hideout instead. Next up, we need to touch on recoil and fire rate, as once you start modding a few guns, these factors become much more important. Given the AK's 650 RPM, they tend to be noticeably more controllable. For the same recoil stat, you get less real recoil out of an AK, purely due to the larger time period between each round. The M4 doesn't get a chance to recover as much, and so the recoil is more noticeable. M4 modding is then even more important, otherwise it all just gets a bit sprayy, but the cost of this can be quite large to get the same recoil, which is made even worse by the fact that you can't buy the parts until the traders really do love you a lot. On the flip side of this is the decreased time to kill of the M4. As the fire rate is faster, you can obviously get off more rounds in a shorter period of time, so in a straight fight between equally skilled players, in theory you should win. Touching back to ammo again, at the bottom end, 545 and 556 rounds are pretty trash and should only be used at the start of the wipe. This is why I recommend 7.62 PS for beginners, as although the recoil is high, you will actually kill people with it. The gap isn't as wide as it once was, but 7.62 PS is a bit better against level 4 armor than say T or PS for 545 and M855 for 556. The fire rate of M855 kinda makes up for it, but you shouldn't be using M4 at this stage anyway for reasons that we discussed earlier. BP and BT for 545 are alright, but with the lower fire rate you really want to be using BS, as long as you don't pay 1000 rubles a shot for them. BS and Ingolnik are great, but they are very expensive, especially when used in full auto. You can buy BS using the Prapor level 3 hot rod trade, but it's a bit of a pain as you can only buy 3 per reset and you get 30 in a box which you then have to get the rounds out of and then delete the wrapper. I don't know about you, but for some reason this bothers me quite a lot when I'm kitting up. When hot rods are around 12k on the flea market, however, this makes them decently cheap at about 800 roughly. On the flea, both BS and Ingolnik are typically 1k, and they are basically the same round after the thorax health increase, as they now both need 3 hits to kill. This used to be different, as BS would kill in 2 and Ingol in 3, but this has now gone away. I've said it before, but on the 5.56 side, M855 A1 is amazing for value versus performance at just over $2 a shot from Peacekeeper, whereas M995 is way too expensive at $13 per round. On M855 A1, I feel like the extra fire rate makes up for the lack of pen, and it sits right in between BS and BT when it comes to the actual penetration value itself. It also has the added advantage of being able to two-shot thoraxes with its 45 damage, which M995, Ingolnik and BS all cannot. Obviously this doesn't apply versus armor, but it's nice to have that flexibility versus most slings and scavs. This is what makes the M4 so good later into the game. Also, if you're using 60 rounders, the 5.56 ammo is a good 35k cheaper per magazine, which really starts to add up over time. One other point to bear in mind is on insurance. You can assign some percentage of probability of getting your kit back whenever you die, obviously except for on labs, which makes all of your equipment effectively cheaper than it looks. I think this is almost certainly greater than 10%, which is roughly the insurance cost, and so to me it's always worth doing. The 35k saving on rounds is interesting because, bearing in mind what we just discussed, the BS and Ingolnik rounds cost even more than they look relative to the kit, due to the fact that you can never get them back on insurance. For the loadout, naturally you're more likely to get back an AK unless it has a folding stock to make it super diddy. Some M4s can be made massive with long barrels, which is better, but as these guns are just more expensive generally, people will drop other AKs they've picked up to grab your M4 instead. So in summary, new players should start with the AK platform and use 7.62 AKMS with PS if possible. Once you've got a few trader levels and start modding your guns, move to 5.45 AKs for the plentiful and cheap parts, lower recoil, and better ammo once 7.62 PS is not good enough. Sadly, 7.62 BP is very similar in price to BS for 5.45 with the hot rod trade, and so it's just not really worth running AKMs. Finally, make the transition to M4s after you've got trader level 3 with Peacekeeper and Mechanic, due to the availability and cheapness of M855 A1 and the lower time to kill that you get from the weapon, along with a great sense of having made it and the first step becoming an actual Chad in Tarkov. So let me know where you stand on the topic in the comments below, and remember to sub and hit the bell if you want to see more. You can also follow me on Twitter, and I stream on Twitch on Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturday evenings UK time. So until then, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.